Memoirs of a Royal Guard. Written by Ansel. Chapter 12. The Plague. It seemed that having a very special sun pony was not that much different from having a close friend. Iridescence and I still did the same things we did before, but now there was a shared secret between us. There was also a higher percentage of time spent hugging, cuddling, and the occasional kiss. Beyond that, I now had the charge of being more considerate, whatever that meant. Iridescence and I sat at a small table in our room, playing a game. We were trying to ensure that the 4 deadly viruses didn't infect all of Equestria. It was going to be okay, but this was the sort of game that creeps up on you. Everything seems to be fine, and then every pony suddenly dies. There was a knock at the door, and then it opened. Sergeant Windchaser came in and said, "Good morning, ponies." She was a Pegasus like me, and had been a royal guard for ages. Her mane and coat had long since started to gray, and most of us saw her as more of a den mother than a squad leader. That isn't to say she isn't good at her job, because she was. Her style was just far more friendly. I smiled and Iridescence said, "Good morning, Sergeant. What can we do for you today?" "I hate to interrupt your game, but I was actually looking for Silent Night." She pointed a hoof at me for emphasis. "Miley Hooves has come down with a nasty case of the flu. Would you mind starting your week early and working one more shift to cover up for her?" Of course I wouldn't mind. I never minded doing my job. In fact, I liked it. Then a subtle look from Iridescence caught my attention. We had a quick picnic planned for the lunch that day, which also happened to be our last day off before we went back to work. She had gone to great length to set it up. She was also the one that said we should keep our relationship quiet. If I said no, the sergeant might have asked why. I'll have to make an excuse, something believable like I have an appointment. That wasn't made up, it was true. "No problem, Sergeant." "No, stupid, honest mouth." The withering look my unicorn companion shot at me was almost physically debilitating. Sergeant Windchaser didn't seem to notice. She smiled and replied, "I knew I could count on you. Thank you." She then abandoned me to face Iridescence alone. Once the door was closed, Iridescence repeated in my mock version of the voice, "No problem, Sergeant." Navigating this conversation was going to be requiring strategy, care, and bravery. I calmly laid my cards down. Had I said no, she may have questioned me, and you know better than any pony that I'm incapable of lying. I was following your instructions. "My instructions, huh?" I nodded. Yes, to keep things quiet, and especially in front of the sergeant and officers. A reasonable defense. One thing I learned about having a special sun pony was that being more considerate also meant not necessarily being logical. Iridescence gave me a look and then said, "In this case, I agree. Although I feel like you always put the job first." She sighed. "It's also really a shame. We had such fun plans." Of course I put the job first. It was our job. Picnics could wait. The princess needed protection. I kept those thoughts to myself, however. "I agree. Can we move it out to a week?" She smiled. I really liked that smile. "I think we can. Everything but the food will keep. Just don't volunteer for any extra shifts if you can help it." "No problem." Miley Hooves, it seemed, was not the innocent flu-stricken victim originally reported. She was, in fact, the harbinger of the plague. By midweek, 3/4 of the Princess Luna's house guard were sick, including Iridescence and Sergeant Windchaser. I was filing in for every pony I could and tending to Iridescence. On top of that, command had me made an acting sergeant. Technically, I had not volunteered for any more shifts. At that point, our leaders pretty much expected those of us that had not fallen ill to pick up the slack. Things were getting so tight that they actually brought over trainees from some of the basic palace guard work. Those ponies loved that. It was a dream come true, I'm sure. At least until they caught the flu too. That pretty much turned the dream into a queasy nightmare. I stood in the background of Princess Luna's chamber while she and Princess Celestia discussed the recent business with Discord. Typically, I make it a point not to eavesdrop on official business. This was a matter of personal pride and the good quality of a guard. Of course, it was very easy not to pay attention that day, since I was half asleep. The princesses were loudly discussing the possibility of rehabilitating some pony. At least I think it was some pony. After all, they'd been talking about Discord prior. It was somewhat heated debate either way. I got the impression that Princess Luna wasn't thrilled with the idea. The discussion went on for a while before I felt myself sway. I quickly stiffened back into attention. It was unprofessional, and I felt ashamed, but I also somewhat confused. Princess Celestia had just vanished. Alicorn magic was amazing, and Princess Luna was laughing softly and looking at me. "Princess?" I asked cautiously. She smiled and said, "Fear not, Silent Knight. We shall not tell." "Tell what?" I glanced at the window to see that the sun was substantially lower in the sky, and then it dawned on me. "Princess, was I asleep?" "Verily, it looked as thou needed it desperately and we did not wish to disturb," she said warmly. "Be not ashamed. Thou hast taken on too much work for one pony." I was incredibly ashamed. Falling asleep on the job was the most embarrassing thing I could think of. I reprimanded myself was in order. I would report myself to the sergeant as soon as my shift ended. The hoof lightly landed on my shoulder. Princess looked at me with concern. "Thou art the most diligent guard who has not been able to take the appropriate time to rest for days. Promise us thou wilt go and sleep tonight." The thought to argue procedure and duty briefly popped into my mind, but the look in the princess's eyes told me she would hear none of that. "Yes, Princess." I'd report myself, then go to sleep. The guard that relieved me, whoever he was, showed up right on time instead of early. I was too tired to comment on it. He looked pretty worse for wear, too. On the way to our room, I kept my head up, doing my best to look 100%. An acting sergeant, even an exhausted one, still had to set a good example for every pony else. Coming through the door, I found our room to be dimly lit. Iridescence was awake and reading. "How do you feel?" I asked her as I came over to check on her softly. I felt her forehead and then picked her pillow up to fluff it. "Better. Still fatigued, but better." She looked at me with concern once I finished with her pillow, and I set it back behind her. "I'm glad." I smiled, went over to our table, and set out to a parchment. It was time to start writing out my report. "What are you doing?" she asked. I set the pencil down so I could explain. "I fell asleep on shift. I'm reporting myself to the sergeant." Iridescence tilted her head. "But you're the sergeant right now." That was true. I was acting sergeant, wasn't I? "That will save some time then," I replied. I awoke the next morning with a blanket over my shoulders and my head on the table, still in my armor and completely stiff. My everything hurt and, with a groan, I shifted out of the chair. "Good morning," Iridescence said to me from her bed. How long was I out? A sense of worry filled me. Was I late for my shift? Iridescence lifted a hope and replied, "Easy there, champ. Only 6 hours or so. I slept most of it too. I wasn't strong enough to get your armor off. Sorry about that." 6 hours. Thank goodness. I had plenty of time to do the sergeant's work and then get back to my post. It's okay. You're sick. Thank you for the blanket. I'll go get your breakfast for you." She smiled and shook her head. "You don't have to do that." "No, but I want to." I picked up and delivered Iridescence's breakfast, snuck a quick shower in, filled out all the paperwork for the sergeant, and left her a note about falling asleep. I didn't have time for a formal write-up. She could decide what to do with that when she was well. On my way to start my shift, Shining Armor stopped me. "Silent Knight, a moment, please." I was suddenly concerned he knew about me sleeping, although I highly doubted Princess Luna would have told him. "You're putting in a ton of hours lately," he said, "taking up slack for almost every other pony." "I'm just doing my part, sir." He smiled and nodded. "I know, and I'm doing mine. I requested some additional guards that can be trusted. They'll fill in for the house guard for a few weeks. Effective immediately, you're off guard duty. You're acting sergeant, and a sergeant doesn't have this time to stand guard for 12 hours a day, or however many beyond that you've been doing." Standing guard was what I did. Being with the princess never felt like work. She was a wonderful pony. At least the change of duty was only temporary. I nodded. "Yes, sir. Understood. Who's taking my shift today, then?" "The ponies won't arrive until tomorrow, so today it'll be me," he said. "You, sir?" I asked, surprised. He laughed. "Yes, Silent Knight. I still remember how to do the job." He winked at me and said, "Go get some rest. You look awful. Your temporary guards will report for tomorrow, and you'll need to be on your A game to ensure they are up to the task. Yes, sir, I replied and turned to go. He was a good officer. Thank you, sir, I called after him before heading back to my room. I stuck in quietly, which was unnecessary because it was still daytime, and Iridescence looked up from her book. Did you quit? She asked, knowing perfectly well I never would. Struggling to get my armor off, I huffed. Bah. The captain took my shift, bringing in new guards temporarily. Still sergeant. Kicking off the hoof guards, I decided I'd worry about where they landed tomorrow. I crawled into my bed, and it had never felt so wonderful. That was nice of him, I vaguely heard Iridescence say, followed by my muffled response of, uh-huh. We discussed a few more things. I don't really recall what. The sweet talk from my pillow was much more interesting, and I fell for its siren's call. The next morning I felt amazing. It was fueled by a fool's night rest and the fact that Iridescence was feeling much better. She still wasn't able to work, but she was back up to her usual self at home. She even helped me put my armor on. There, you look perfect, she said before straightening my helmet. Ready for your big day, Sergeant? I frowned a little at that. It's only temporary. Then I can go back to being your partner and guarding the princess. She actually bonked me on the nose with her hoof. Temporary leads to permanent, and Windchaser will retire sooner or later. You don't want to stand guard forever, do you? My nose wrinkled. I wouldn't mind. You're more of a sergeant than I am. You can talk to ponies. Iridescence bonked me again. I'm not going to be a guard forever, but I suspect you are. Now go out there and be the best sergeant ever. For emphasis, she gave me a little kiss. I preferred that to being bonked. My cheeks flushed, but I put on my sergeant's face and went out to meet the temporary replacements. The group was clearly comprised of some of the best Royal Guard ponies from around Equestria. I could tell immediately by the way they stood and carried themselves. They were almost completely misfit. No two had exactly the same armor. Each were slightly different based on the region and unit. It may have looked like a mess, but it didn't make any sense to issue armor temporarily. Good morning. I am Silent Knight, acting sergeant. You've been selected temporarily to fill in as house guard for Princess Luna. We have 3 simple rules here. As long as you follow them, we'll get along just fine. 1. She is not Nightmare Moon. Don't mention that name, don't joke or ask about it, forgive and forget. 2. You are a member of the House Guard. There is no different than Princess Celestia's House Guard. It carries the same honor and responsibilities. Act accordingly, set a good example for others. 3. My door is always open. If you need me, do not hesitate to ask. Do you understand our rules? The group of ponies replied in unison. Yes, Sergeant. I nodded. Good. I've posted your shift schedules outside my office. You start tonight. If you're not on shift, be sure to take in the sights of Canterlot. There won't be time wasted. Dismissed. The group filed off to do their jobs. Perhaps being a sergeant might be for me after all. I could always look in on Princess Luna. Of course, that also meant more danger for Iridescence in my career. You can't be with a pony of a different rank that you supervise, especially one that reports to the exact same commander. I frowned at that and turned to head to my office. Shining Hour had been right behind me. I sprung to attention and saluted instead of crashing into him. He saluted back. Nice work. You'll make a fine sergeant. Not yet, sir. I haven't gotten my pony skills down. Still learning the life outside of the job part. I replied. Shining Armor looked a bit surprised by that. Surprised and impressed. Every pony does things differently. You're just more by the book. Sooner or later, your chance will come. Today, however, acting sergeant is fine. Acting sergeant and guard first class. He lifted a box out of his pack and opened it, and there was a small black-backed silver pin inside that featured 3 diagonal bars. He replaced the 2 bars on my breastplate with a new one and set the old into the box. Closing the lid, he offered to me and said, Congratulations. You've earned this. I accepted it with pride. Thank you, sir. The captain headed off to his commitments, and I made my way to Winchester's office to do mine. Silent Knight, guard first class. That had a nice ring to it. There we go. Another wonderful chapter of Memoirs. My apologies, I was going to put out a Luna Guardsman today, but I simply got too caught up, and I really wanted to put something out today. I'm trying to keep with at least every other day, so I hope this will suffice. I know a lot of you like this series. And what else I like are my wonderful Patreons. Thank you, Chase the Master, Starlight Blaze, Stu Hex, Thine Tiny Equine, Squall Windfeather, The Animated Ghost, Captain Blue Shadow, Solus, HKH4 aka Texture, and of course a large thank you to Silent Titan. I appreciate you guys' support so much. If you want other ways to support me, well, your viewership is more than enough. However, leaving a like, comment, and of course subscribing does mean a lot to me and does help me in the algorithm, so clickety click click. Another thing is I have a little blooper. I know actually quite a few of you asked for bloopers at the end of these reels, so here's one just to test the waters. I hope you guys find it as funny as I did. Anyways, this has been Firehearth. Have a wonderful day. The guard that relieved me, whoever he was, showed up right on time instead of early. I was too tired to come on it. Come on it. Comment. Do not come on that guard.